Welcome. We are stepping into the corridors of the human mind, to a place where the line between reality and role-play blurs until it vanishes completely. In the annals of psychology, few studies have left a scar as deep as the one we will discuss today. It begins with a man, Dr. Philip Zimbardo. In 1971, he was the principal investigator at the Stanford University Psychology Department. He wasn't looking to study prisons merely for the sake of criminal justice. He was looking to study us. This is the story of the Stanford Prison Experiment. It is a story about authority, about submission, and about how quickly the mask of civilization can slip when the rules of the world are rewritten. To understand why this happened, we have to start with a question. It is the core question of social psychology. Disposition versus situation. Ask yourself, are people inherently bad? Is evil a disposition, something written into our DNA? Or does the environment make them bad? This was the hypothesis Zimbardo sought to test. He believed in the power of the barrel, the environment, to rot the apples, the people. The theory was terrifying in its simplicity. That the situation could completely overpower individual character. If you put a good person in a bad place, does the person change the place, or does the place destroy the person? The nightmare began innocently enough. It started with a newspaper advertisement. The ad asked for male college students needed for a psychological study. The incentive? Pay of $15 per day, which, adjusted for inflation, is approximately $100 a day in today's currency. The response was massive. 70 applicants applied and were rigorously screened for psychological stability and health. Zimbardo wanted a blank slate. He selected 24 young men. They were white, middle class, healthy, and deemed normal. These weren't criminals. They weren't sadists. They were average students looking for summer cash. They had no idea what they were signing away. The stimulation was supposed to start at the university. Instead, it started at their front doors. On Sunday morning, August 14th, the participants were woken up by a siren. Real Palo Alto police officers arrived at their homes to arrest them. This wasn't acting. They were publicly handcuffed, searched, and read their legal rights in front of their shocked neighbors. This was the first psychological strike. The goal was to create immediate shock and a complete loss of personal control. From the very first moment, the participants experienced genuine fear and confusion. The experiment hadn't even officially begun, and already their reality was being dismantled. They were taken to the basement of the Stanford Psychology building, but the basement was gone. In its place was the yard. It was a boarded-up hallway serving as the communal exercise area. Crucially, there was no natural light, creating immediate disorientation. There was the hole, a small closet used for solitary confinement, a pitch-black space for punishment. And the cells? They were small offices, but the doors had been replaced by metal bars. There were no clocks, no windows. The subjects were trapped in a space designed for complete temporal and spatial disorientation. They were no longer at Stanford. Once inside, the process of dehumanization began immediately. The intake process was brutal. The boys were stripped naked and deloused with a cleaning spray to humiliate them. Their clothes were taken away. Instead, they were given a smock, a dress-like garment, with absolutely no underwear underneath. To strip them of their individuality, they were forced to wear nylon stocking caps to simulate shaved heads. And perhaps most damaging of all, their names were taken. They were referred to only by ID numbers like 8612. They were being erased. While the prisoners were stripped down, the guards were built up. Their transformation was equally calculated. They wore military-style khaki uniforms and carried wooden batons. These weren't just tools. They were symbols of power. Perhaps the most genius and terrifying detail was the eyewear. The guards wore mirrored aviator sunglasses. This prevented any eye contact. It created a mask of anonymity and authority. Their instructions were vague but dangerous. They were told to maintain order using psychological means. No physical violence was officially allowed, but verbal abuse and intimidation were permitted. They were given a blank check for cruelty. It took less than 24 hours for the system to break. On day 2, a rebellion erupted. The prisoners resisted. They ripped off their identification numbers and barricaded themselves inside their cells using their beds. The guards, realizing verbal orders were useless, decided to escalate. They grabbed fire extinguishers. They blasted the prisoners with chilling chemical spray to force them back from the bars. This was the critical moment. The simulation shifted from play to something psychologically real. The game was over. After the rebellion, the guards realized they couldn't control the bodies of the prisoners, so they decided to control their minds. They employed a divide and conquer strategy. They created a privilege cell. The guards selected the most compliant prisoners and gave them special treatment, proper food, and comfortable beds, while the bad prisoners starved and slept on concrete. Then they switched them. Confused prisoners began to whisper, "Who is secretly informing on us?" It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It successfully broke prisoner solidarity and prevented any further organized resistance. The stress was corrosive. Prisoner 8612, a student named Douglas Corpy, was the first to crack. In less than 36 hours of confinement, he suffered a complete psychological breakdown. His symptoms were terrifying: uncontrollable screaming, explosive rage, and hysterical crying. At first, the staff thought he was faking, but Zimbardo eventually released him after recognizing genuine psychological distress. This was the first red flag, the first indication that the experiment had crossed ethical boundaries. But they didn't stop. As the prisoners shrank, one guard grew larger than life. Dave Eshelman, nicknamed the John Wayne Guard, he deliberately decided to play an exaggerated, cruel character. He adopted a southern accent inspired by the film Cool Hand Luke, but his performance became a nightmare for the prisoners. He created increasingly degrading punishments. He forced prisoners to clean toilets with their bare hands. He became the most sadistic guard, constantly pushing the boundaries of psychological abuse. He proved that give a man a mask, and he will show you his true face. Then came visiting day. This was the moment the study could have collapsed. Parents came to visit their sons in this makeshift prison. Zimbardo was terrified. He worried parents would see the conditions and withdraw their children from the study. So he staged a cover-up. He forced the prisoners to clean the facility. He fed them a large dinner. He even played cheerful music over the intercom. It became a carefully staged performance, a theater production within the experiment itself. The parents saw what Zimbardo wanted them to see, and they left their sons behind. By the middle of the week, something disturbing happened to the man in charge. Dr. Zimbardo lost his objectivity. He ceased to be a researcher collecting data. He assumed the role of prison superintendent. He became obsessed with prison security rather than scientific observation. This is what he called ethical blindness. He completely lost his ethical compass. The experiment had consumed its own creator. He was no longer running the system, he was part of the system. The horror peaked with prisoner 819. Like Corpy before him, 819 began to suffer a severe psychological breakdown. But the guards weren't done. They forced the other prisoners to chant aloud, "819 is a bad prisoner. 819 is a bad prisoner." 819 heard this. He refused to leave the experiment because he didn't want to be labeled bad. Zimbardo had to physically intervene. He grabbed the boy and said, "You are not a prisoner. You are a student." It took a direct reminder of reality to snap him out of the delusion. The spell was finally broken by an outsider. Christina Maslach, a PhD student and Zimbardo's girlfriend, came to interview the participants. She walked down the stairs and witnessed a line of prisoners being marched to the toilet with paper bags over their heads. She was sickened. She turned to Zimbardo and said, "It's terrible what you are doing to these boys." Of the more than 50 outsiders who had seen the prison, she was the only person to question the experiment's ethics. She was the whistleblower. The wake-up call worked. The shutdown was ordered. The experiment was designed to run for 2 full weeks, 14 days. It lasted only 6. The reaction to the end was telling. The guards were genuinely disappointed. They had been enjoying their power. The prisoners, broken and exhausted, were enormously relieved to finally escape the psychological torture. The nightmare was over, but the analysis was just beginning. What did we learn from 6 days of hell? Zimbardo coined the term the Lucifer effect. The conclusion was clear. Situation triumphs over disposition. The study showed that good people can commit evil acts when placed in toxic situations. It identified 2 key drivers of cruelty: deindividuation, the loss of self-awareness, and role override, where the assigned mask of guard or prisoner consumes the individual personality. We are not as autonomous as we think we are. But knowledge came at a steep price. The study is now a textbook example of ethical violations. There was a total lack of informed consent. The participants didn't know about the realistic arrests or the psychological manipulation tactics. The true nature of the study was deliberately concealed, and there was no protection from harm. Participants suffered genuine psychological abuse. Even their right to withdraw, a fundamental human right, was systematically undermined by Zimbardo. In recent years, the narrative has shifted. In 2018, an expose revealed cracks in the story. Evidence emerged that Zimbardo may have coached the guards to behave more cruelly, rather than it happening naturally. This is known as demand characteristics, where participants act how they believe the researcher wants them to act. Even the famous breakdown of prisoner 8612 was called into question. Douglas Corpy later admitted he was consciously faking his breakdown. His goal wasn't escaping a prison. He just wanted to leave early to study for his graduate school exams. Flawed or not, the legacy of the Stanford Prison Experiment is undeniable. It fundamentally changed the ethical rules for psychology research worldwide, leading to the creation of institutional review boards to protect participants. But its darkest lesson remains relevant. Years later, when the Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal broke in 2004, the images mirrored Stanford almost perfectly. It stands as a stark warning about unchecked authority and the dangers of dehumanization. It asks us to look in the mirror and wonder, if given the badge and the sunglasses, what would you become?